Welcome to Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with astronomer Hugh Ross. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome.
We're going to talk today about a YouTube comment that we received. A viewer was asking if it's better to preach to the masses versus doing friendship evangelism. So I'd love to first dive into what is friendship evangelism and what is preaching to the masses.
Well, friendship evangelism is where Christians are encouraged to share their faith with their friends and their relatives, people they know well.
Right.
Mass evangelism is where you're basically focusing on strangers in a big group, whether it be a stadium, whether it be addressing people online or radio show. We're basically targeting hundreds or thousands as opposed to just one individual.
I think the heart of that comment was likely the person is concerned that we're going to limit the number of people we can reach if we're only reaching our friends. So I like the distinction that you make between friendship evangelism, which, we should be doing, stranger evangelism, which would be interacting with someone and you just hear a need. You hear that there's something that you can respond to and have some sort of evidence that you're sharing with this person in a very organic way. And
well,
then,
Sandra, let me share with you what I observed when I was a full-time minister of evangelism, is that Christians that focus on friendship evangelism to the exclusion of sharing their faith with strangers, they tend to be too slow on recognizing when someone is really ready to make the commitment. On the other hand, I would deal with Christians who only share their faith with strangers, and they had the opposite. They were a little too forceful, a little too quick.
right.
And so what I found is it's important to have balance in your life, to be spending time sharing your faith with non-Christian friends and relatives, but also with strangers, so that you can maintain that balance of being able to encourage them to make good commitments, but not in a way that comes across as obnoxious or forceful,
Right.
but not to be so slow on the trigger that you don't meet people's needs.
Right, and I think that's helpful. So what we see as a con, in a sense, for friendship evangelism is that we might be a little bit too slow in recognizing that they're responding.
There's a relationship we have with them, and we're worried about that relationship being damaged or broken. And so we tend to hesitate, and we often should move forward. And again, the problem of all you do is focus on strangers. You can tend to be a little too pushy, too aggressive,
Right.
and too anxious to put a notch on your belt.
Right, and that's true. I think a con, in a sense, for evangelizing just to strangers is that we might not recognize that they will appreciate hearing information in a certain way if we know them well and if we can kind of understand their personality a bit more, and we can't nuance the conversation if it's a stranger in the same way we can with friends. Not to say that we don't do it, though.
Right.
In fact, the whole thrust of not only Reasons to Believe, but this show specifically, it's to invite people to step into the call that we have in Matthew 28:19 to make disciples of all nations. So we are absolutely for people sharing the gospel. You mentioned being a full-time minister of evangelism. What were some of the tactics that really worked well when you were engaging with others?
Well, in terms of engaging strangers, I notice that many Christians tend to be only focused on getting them to make some kind of spiritual commitment and not taking the time to find out what kind of non-Christian you're talking to. And so taking time to ask them questions, see where they're coming from personally, what their issues and barriers are, and then you can begin to provide the reasons so that they can come to faith in Christ.
So you mentioned what kind of non-Christian or non-believer they are. To me, it sounds like you're hinting at if you're a doctor and someone's sick, that you're giving everyone the same treatment, but we wouldn't do that. So
one size doesn't fit all.
Right. So explain some of those kinds.
Well, the Bible talks about evangelism as planting seeds, as gardening, as weeding, and as harvesting. But notice seeds are different. If you're planting radishes, you can harvest in less than 3 months. If you're planting almonds, it's about 8 years. And humans are the same way. Depending on the kind of individual you're dealing with, you may be looking at a long process. I've shared with people that research scientists and research engineers that don't have a background in Christianity haven't read the Bible, really don't know Christians, you're probably looking at a minimum of 18 months for them to become familiar enough with Christianity and its claims before they're willing to make a commitment. Whereas I've met other people where literally within a week they got it all put together and they can make their commitment.
Right. That's a great reminder to really understand, even when we're interacting with strangers, to try to understand and hear and listen from them what their experiences are and what they might be kind of struggling with as far as an obstacle to faith. Now, something that I think is really wonderful is that you have a book on evangelism, and that's called Always Be Ready. And I think what's really inspiring about that book is that it encourages people who feel like they might not have a direct role in evangelizing to others. So when you talked about those who are planting and reaping and working that garden, that some might feel like they are maybe preparing the ground, but they aren't actually reaping the harvest because maybe they feel like that's not their role. So what would you say to encourage those folks?
Well, we all have a role. And for many of us, we're spending our time weeding and gardening.
Right.
But I also say, if you really focus on the gardening, you will have opportunities to reap. But that you're not going to be able to reap if nobody's gardening.
Right.
And that's where most of the work is. I mean, again, I like the analogy of we're planting seeds and reaping a harvest. The reaping part is not the majority of what's going on in terms of agriculture. That's the tip.
Right.
Same thing with evangelism. We need to put most of our human resources into the planting and the weeding and the gardening. Yes, we need to be reaping, but we need to realize for every one reaper, we're probably going to need 9 gardeners and 9 people that are plowing and putting in the seeds.
Well, that's really encouraging because I think it will help people feel like they do have a role in leading someone of faith, and maybe it's 2 steps down, but they're still playing a role in that.
Well, I put it this way. Your job, no matter what kind of non-Christian you're dealing with, is to get them a little farther along the path towards Christ.
Right.
And, don't be concerned if you can't take them all the way. In fact, I think it's important you not take them all the way, because if you try that with someone who's an almond as opposed to a radish seed, you're going to offend them and you're going to make it harder for other gardeners.
Right. So give us 2 quick tips, something that you would say to, like a practical tip for someone wanting to share their faith, and then maybe a tactic that isn't as useful or as helpful.
Well, practice.
Practice.
I mean, you don't become a good gardener right off the bat, but get started. And so I encourage everybody, get involved in the enterprise. Yes, you're going to make mistakes, but get feedback. I think one of the best tips is, when you share your faith and you sense it's not going well, ask the person, can you tell me where I've been obnoxious or where I kind of...
Yeah.
And I find non-Christians are quite eager to tell you. And just benefit from that.
Right.
Get feedback from Christians that are watching you.
Right.
And so I think that's important because we're all becoming better evangelists.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Hugh. If you want to hear more on this topic from Hugh Ross, check out Always Be Ready. You can find that at shop.reasons.org.